My hidden trail camera up in the tree caught this bizarre footage. Government agents surrounding a cage with something that should not exist. A dog man. A living cryptid. Had I known what would happen next, I would have never looked at that footage. I pulled the SD card from my trail camera on May 29th, 4 days later than I usually check it. Work had kept me away longer than planned, and by the time I made it back to my hunting spot, everything looked normal. The forest was quiet, the game trail undisturbed, nothing to suggest anything unusual had happened while I was gone. I took the card home expecting the typical footage of deer and maybe a coyote or two. The file was short, only 5 seconds of footage, but those 5 seconds changed everything I thought I knew about the woods I'd hunted for 30 years. The timestamp read, May 25th at 11:40 a.m. The temperature sensor showed 52 degrees, and filling my screen was something I'd been told my entire life didn't exist. A massive steel cage sat in the clearing below my camera. The cage was huge, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, built from reinforced steel with welds at every joint that looked industrial grade. Inside that cage, clearly visible even in the daylight footage, was a creature standing upright at over 7 feet tall. The head was unmistakably canine with a pronounced snout and pointed ears. The shoulders were massive and hunched forward. The arms were too long, reaching past where the knees would be, ending in hands with visible claws. The creature was pacing, moving back and forth in the confined space with obvious agitation. For just a moment in the footage, it turned and looked directly at my camera. The eyes reflected the daylight, bright and aware, tracking the camera position with unmistakable intelligence. Then the 5-second clip ended. That was all I had. 5 seconds of proof that something impossible was real. I replayed those 5 seconds dozens of times, trying to convince myself it was fake or misidentified, or anything other than what it obviously was. But there was no denying what the footage showed. A dog man. A real creature matching every description from the Michigan legends, captured and caged by people who clearly knew what they were dealing with. The cage itself told a story. This wasn't improvised. This was purpose-built equipment designed specifically for containing something large, strong, and dangerous. Before I go further into what I learned from this footage and what happened after, make sure you subscribe and let us know where you're watching from. Thanks. After watching those 5 seconds over and over until I'd memorized every detail, I grabbed my truck keys and drove back to the camera location. It was late afternoon by then, and I needed to see the site for myself. I needed to find some evidence that what I'd seen on that screen was real, and not some elaborate hoax or camera malfunction. The drive felt longer than usual, my mind racing through explanations that might make sense. When I reached the spot, there was nothing. The clearing looked exactly as it always had. No tire tracks, no footprints, no disturbed vegetation where heavy equipment would have been positioned. I walked the entire area in expanding circles looking for anything that might confirm what my camera had recorded 4 days earlier. The ground was undisturbed. The grass and brush showed no signs of recent traffic. If a steel cage and whatever vehicles brought it there had occupied this space, they'd left no trace. That's when I understood what I was dealing with. This wasn't just a capture operation. This was a cleanup operation. Whoever these people were, they had the resources and expertise to remove all evidence of their presence. They'd been here with heavy equipment and a caged cryptid, and they'd left the forest looking untouched. That level of thoroughness suggested training, funding, and experience. This was government work. I checked my camera thoroughly. It was still functioning normally. Still aimed at the same game trail it had been monitoring for months. The memory card slot showed no signs of tampering. Whatever had triggered the 5-second recording, it had captured something they either didn't know about or didn't consider worth removing. Maybe they'd missed my camera in their sweep. Maybe they'd decided one grainy clip wouldn't matter. Either way, I had the only evidence that this operation had happened. I've been a hunter since my father first took me into the Michigan wilderness at age 8. I know these woods. I know what belongs here and what doesn't. I've tracked wounded deer through 3 counties, found lost hikers, and spent more nights under the canopy than in my own bed some years. I'm not someone who jumps at shadows or believes every campfire story about monsters in the forest. But I'm also not someone who ignores evidence when it's captured on a time-stamped video file. That 5-second clip from May 25th at 11:40 a.m. showed me something undeniable. The cage was real, industrial grade, purpose-built for containing something specific. The creature inside was real, moving with the kind of fluid motion that no costume or CGI could replicate in amateur footage. The intelligence in its eyes when it looked at the camera was real, and the implications of someone having the resources to build that cage and transport it into remote forest were terrifying. I started connecting that footage to experiences I'd rationalized away over the years, things I'd seen or heard in the woods that didn't fit normal patterns, encounters I'd explained as bears or wolves or tricks of light and shadow. Now I had context for those experiences, and that context suggested I'd been sharing these forests with creatures that weren't supposed to exist, creatures the government apparently knew about and was actively managing. The Odawa and Ojibwe tribes who lived here long before European settlers arrived told stories about shapeshifters and forest spirits that took canine form. They called them different names, but the descriptions matched. A creature that was neither fully wolf nor fully human, something that existed in between and demanded respect from anyone who ventured too deep into its territory. I'd always dismissed those stories as folklore. Every region has its monster. The Pacific Northwest has Bigfoot, New Jersey has the Jersey Devil, and Michigan has the Dogman. They're good for tourism and campfire scares, but they're not real. At least that's what I believed until I watched trained military personnel transport one in a reinforced cage through the middle of nowhere at 4 in the morning. The more I watched that footage, the more pieces started falling into place from experiences I'd rationalized away over the years. 3 years ago, I'd been boo hunting during early October in a section of forest about 20 miles west of my camera location. The afternoon was perfect, cool and clear with just enough wind to cover my scent. I'd been in my tree stand for maybe 2 hours when I heard something moving through the undergrowth below me. At first the sound matched a deer browsing through fallen leaves, but deer don't maintain a steady pace for extended periods. They move, stop to test the air, move again, always cautious. This thing moved with purpose, traveling in a straight line that paralleled the ridge I was watching. I assumed it was another hunter, maybe someone who didn't realize how close they were to my position. I stood slowly in my stand, preparing to signal my presence so they wouldn't accidentally walk into my shooting lane. But what I saw through the trees wasn't another hunter. It was something large and dark, moving through patches of sunlight and shadow in a way that made it hard to focus on. The glimpses I caught showed fur, definitely fur, but the posture was all wrong for any animal I knew. Then it stopped. I froze, my hand still on the tree trunk, barely breathing. For maybe 30 seconds nothing moved. The normal forest sounds had vanished. No birds calling, no squirrels rustling in the canopy, nothing but silence pressing down like physical weight. Then I heard a sound I'd never forget. It was a low rumble, almost like a dog's growl, but deeper, resonating in a way that suggested something much larger than any dog. The thing started moving again, but this time it was coming toward my tree. I could see it more clearly now through breaks in the undergrowth. Dark brown or black fur covered its body. The head had a distinctly canine profile when it turned to look upwind, but it was walking upright, moving through the forest on 2 legs with the easy balance of something that had always walked that way. It passed within 30 yards of my stand, close enough that I could see the muscles moving under its fur, could see the way its head swiveled constantly as it scanned its surroundings. The arms were long and ended in hands that gripped tree trunks as it walked, using them for balance on the steeper parts of the terrain. When it finally moved out of sight, I stayed in my stand for another hour, too shaken to climb down. When I finally made myself climb down and head back to my truck, I walked fast, staying on the established trail and making noise to announce my presence. Every shadow felt like it might be hiding something. Every sound made me jump. When I reached the truck, I looked back at the tree line one last time. There was something standing there, partially obscured by brush, watching me. The shape was too tall to be a deer, too upright to be a bear. I raised my binoculars with shaking hands and tried to focus on it. For just a second I had a clear view. It was massive, easily over 7 feet tall, with a head that was unmistakably wolf-like. The eyes caught the failing afternoon light and reflected it back at me, bright and aware. Then it dropped to all fours and was gone, crashing through the brush with a speed that no bear could match. I told myself it was a bear. I repeated that explanation to anyone who asked why I didn't hunt that section anymore. Bears stand upright regularly. Bears have dark fur. Bears can move fast when they want to. But I knew what I'd seen, and it wasn't a bear. I just didn't have any other explanation that made sense, so I filed it away and tried to forget about it. 5 years before that encounter, something happened to a friend who ran a deer camp in the northern part of the state. He called me one morning in late October, his voice tight in a way I'd never heard before. His camp had been established for 15 years, 6 guys who met there every fall for opening weekend. They knew the area, knew the patterns, and they'd never had problems beyond the usual equipment failures and weather issues. But the previous night, something had circled their camp for hours. Not the random wandering of wildlife, but deliberate circles that got progressively tighter. They first heard it around midnight when one of the guys went out to use the facilities. He came back inside fast, saying something was moving in the trees just beyond the firelight. They all went quiet and listened. The sound was heavy footfalls, breaking through undergrowth with weight behind them. Whatever it was didn't seem concerned about stealth. It circled the entire camp, passing by each of the 3 cabins in sequence. The 2 dogs they had with them, both experienced hunting dogs who'd faced down bears without backing down, cowered under the bunks and whined. One of them actually urinated on the floor, something my friend said that dog had never done in 8 years. They grabbed flashlights and rifles and stepped outside. 6 grown men who'd hunted dangerous game before. The sound stopped the moment they opened the door. Complete silence fell over the camp. They swept their lights across the tree line, looking for eye shine or movement. Nothing. But they could feel something watching them. That primal sense of being observed, that evolution teaches you to trust. They stayed outside for maybe 10 minutes, lights and weapons ready, waiting for whatever it was to show itself. Nothing happened. Finally, they went back inside, but nobody slept. They sat around the main cabin with lights on and guns loaded until dawn. When first light came, they went out to look for tracks. What they found in the mud near their generator shed made my friend pack up and leave that same day. The tracks started about 50 yards out from the cabins. Clear, 4-footed impressions that could have been a large wolf or maybe a big coyote. The stride length was wrong for either of those animals, too long and too purposeful, but you could convince yourself it was explainable. Those tracks circled the entire camp, passing within 10 feet of each building. My friend followed them around the full perimeter, documenting everything with his phone. That is, but near the generator shed, something changed. The 4-footed tracks stopped. In their place were impressions that looked disturbingly human, if humans had feet 18 inches long with clear claw marks at the toe ends. The prints were deep, pressed into mud that should have shown every detail. The thing had stood there on 2 legs for several minutes, based on how the impressions overlapped and shifted. What really disturbed my friend was what they found on the generator shed itself. Scratches in the metal, deep gouges that started about 7 feet up and dragged down to chest height. The marks were too uniform to be accidental damage, too deep to be anything but deliberate. Something had stood on 2 legs and raked claws down the metal siding while the men inside had been trying to decide what to do. My friend never went back to that camp. He sold his share to another hunter and refused to talk about what happened beyond telling me that story once. The other guys in the group were split. Half of them tried to convince themselves it was a bear, despite the evidence. The other half knew better and stayed away. The camp eventually shut down because nobody wanted to spend a night there anymore. I'd heard similar stories from other hunters over the years. A trapper who found his trap line torn apart by something with hands strong enough to bend steel. A forestry worker who spotted what he thought was a person in a fur coat, walking through a clear cut at dawn, until it dropped to all fours and ran faster than any human could move. A bow hunter who swore something growled at him from the darkness just outside his tree stand, a sound too deep and intelligent to be any animal he recognized. All of these incidents happened in the same general region. All of them involved creatures that didn't fit into any normal category of wildlife. And now I had footage of government personnel capturing one of these things like it was a routine operation. That suggested this wasn't the first time. This wasn't a surprise discovery. This was something they knew about and had been managing. After watching that footage dozens of times, after accepting that what I'd captured was real, I started researching disappearances in Michigan forests with new understanding. The state database listed 17 people missing in the northern forest regions over the past 20 years, but that number only included cases that were officially reported and investigated. Local knowledge suggested the real number was higher, but many disappearances in remote areas never made it into official statistics. I began with the documented cases, pulling everything I could find from newspaper archives, police reports released under Freedom of Information requests, and interviews with family members who were still looking for answers. What emerged was a pattern that nobody seemed to notice, or at least nobody was willing to discuss publicly. These weren't random disappearances. They clustered in specific areas and specific times of year. Late fall accounted for 9 of the 17 cases. Early spring claimed another 5. These were the transitional seasons when game movement changed, when predators adjusted their territories, when the forests were less populated with casual hikers, but still accessible to experienced outdoorsmen. The remaining 3 cases from summer were all in extremely remote areas, places requiring serious effort to reach. What disturbed me more than the timing was the experience level of the victims. These weren't inexperienced tourists getting lost on day hikes. 14 of the 17 were serious outdoorsmen, licensed guides, experienced hunters, trappers who'd worked these forests for decades, people who knew how to survive, how to signal for help, how to stay alive in situations that would kill casual visitors. The wildlife biologist's case from 8 years ago became my focal point, and she'd worked for the State Department of Natural Resources for 6 years before vanishing. Her specialty was predator behavior, specifically studying wolf and coyote populations in northern Michigan. She'd been conducting a routine survey in a section of state forest known for consistent wolf sightings when she disappeared. Her truck was found at a forest access point exactly where she'd logged her planned parking location. The keys were in the ignition, her wallet and phone were in the center console, and her field pack with all her survey equipment was in the back seat. Everything suggested she'd planned to return quickly, maybe just a short hike to check camera traps or collect samples. The search operation deployed within hours of her supervisor realizing she'd missed her check-in call. Over 100 volunteers joined professional search teams in combing a 50-square-mile area. They used cadaver dogs, thermal imaging from helicopters, and systematic grid searches that covered every accessible section of forest within her expected range. The search continued for 2 weeks before being scaled back, then ran at reduced intensity for another month. What they found or didn't find was telling. No signs of struggle at her parking location. No blood, no torn clothing, no indication she'd been attacked there. Her planned route based on her field notes led to a ridge where she'd positioned camera traps 2 weeks earlier. Search teams found the cameras. 3 of them were still functioning and had captured footage of standard wildlife movement, but nothing unusual and nothing showing Sarah. About a quarter mile from the camera location, search dogs indicated interest in a small clearing. The handlers described the dogs becoming agitated and confused, showing alert behaviors but then backing away. One dog refused to enter the clearing entirely. Canine teams with decades of search experience reported they'd never seen their dogs behave that way without finding evidence of human presence. The search report, which I obtained through a friend who worked in the county sheriff's office, included a section about unusual tracks found near that clearing. The investigating officer described them as possibly canine, possibly bear, but noted the size was inconsistent with known species. The measurements listed in the report were interesting. 18 inches long, 6 inches wide at the ball, with clear claw marks extending beyond the pad impressions. Those measurements matched nothing in Michigan's documented wildlife inventory. The largest wolf tracks in the state measure about 5 inches long. Bear tracks can reach 11 or 12 inches but have a completely different shape and claw pattern. What the search team found was significantly larger than either, and the stride length suggested bipedal movement for part of the trail. The official conclusion classified Sarah's disappearance as animal attack, with body likely dragged away and consumed or concealed. But experienced trackers and search coordinators I spoke with privately expressed doubt. Predator attacks leave evidence: blood spatter, torn clothing, signs of struggle. Even if a body is completely consumed, there are remnants: hair, bone fragments, scattered belongings. None of that existed here. I found similar patterns in other cases. A hunter who disappeared leaving his rifle leaning against a tree, safety on, chamber full. If he'd encountered a threat, he'd had the weapon in hand but never fired. Either he hadn't perceived danger until too late, or he'd encountered something he didn't believe warranted lethal response until it was beyond his ability to defend himself. A trapper found his entire trap line systematically destroyed over a 3-day period. Steel traps bent out of shape, trigger mechanisms smashed, anchors pulled from the ground. He reported it to wildlife officials and returned to check on the remaining traps. He never came back. Search teams found his four-wheeler abandoned on a forest road, engine running, keys in the ignition, his rifle still in its scabbard. Nearby tracks suggested something had approached the vehicle while it was running. The trapper had dismounted, possibly to investigate something he'd seen or heard. The tracks leading away from the four-wheeler started as human boot prints, walking at a normal pace. About 50 yards into the forest, those boot prints became running. Another 100 yards farther, they stopped completely. There was no evidence of what happened next. A bow hunter disappeared from his tree stand in the middle of an October afternoon. His hunting partner was in another stand 300 yards away, connected by radio. They'd been calling in positions and observations regularly throughout the morning. At 2:15 p.m., the missing hunter called in a sighting of a large deer moving through the ravine between their positions. That was his last communication. His partner heard nothing unusual over the next hour. No shots, no calls for help, no sounds of struggle. When the missing hunter failed to respond to radio checks, his partner climbed down and walked to his location. The tree stand was empty. The safety harness was still attached to the tree, but unbuckled. The hunter's bow hung from its hook, an arrow nocked and ready. His radio sat on the platform, turned on, functioning normally. Directly below the stand, searchers found unusual impressions in the soft ground. Something large had stood there, weight distributed in a way that suggested upright posture. The impressions were approximately 18 inches long and resembled oversized human footprints with claw marks. Multiple impressions overlapped, suggesting whatever made them had stood there for several minutes, looking up at the stand, waiting. The hunter's partner described finding those tracks and immediately feeling the situation was wrong in a way he couldn't articulate. He climbed back into his own stand and called for emergency services rather than searching alone. When deputies arrived and examined the scene, they noted in their report that the situation was suspicious, but concluded the hunter had likely descended from his stand and become lost or injured away from the immediate area. Search teams covered hundreds of acres over the following week. They never found the missing hunter, and they never adequately explained why an experienced outdoorsman would unbuckle his safety harness, leave his weapon and radio behind, and climb down in the middle of a hunt. The partner who'd found the empty stand stopped hunting entirely after that day. He moved out of state 6 months later. The Native American connections to these creatures run deeper and older than most people realize. The Odawa people who lived in this region for thousands of years before European contact told stories about beings they called different names depending on their specific role or manifestation. But the descriptions were remarkably consistent across different bands and time periods. Something walked the deep forests on 2 legs, something that was neither fully human nor fully animal. One particular story stands out from the oral tradition. An Odawa elder I spoke with years ago, long before I had any reason to take these stories seriously, told me about the wending. He said it was a forest spirit that served as a guardian and judge of human behavior. When hunters showed proper respect, taking only what they needed, and giving thanks for what they took. The wending left them alone. But when hunters became greedy or cruel, when they killed without need or wasted what they'd taken, the wending appeared. The elder described it as walking on two legs, specifically to remind humans that it understood their actions, that it wasn't simply an animal operating on instinct. It could track hunters for days, appearing at the edge of firelight or following their trails back toward their villages. Sometimes it would take their kills, leaving the gutted carcasses arranged in ways that made its displeasure clear. Other times it would drive game away from an area entirely, forcing wasteful hunters to return empty-handed and face the judgment of their people. In extreme cases, according to the elder, the wending would take the hunters themselves, not killing them necessarily, but leading them deep into unfamiliar territory until they were hopelessly lost. Some found their way out days later, confused and unable to explain what had happened. Others never returned. Their disappearances served as warnings to the rest of the community about respecting the balance between human needs and forest resources. The Ojibwe people, whose territory overlapped with the Odawa in parts of Michigan, had their own stories about similar creatures. They called them Mahinganini, which translates roughly to wolf person or wolf man. These beings were described as shapeshifters, but not in the European werewolf sense of humans cursed to transform. Instead, they were their own species, beings who existed permanently in a state between human and wolf. Ojibwe stories painted them as powerful, but not necessarily evil. They were territorial, protective of the deep forest places where humans rarely traveled. They avoided contact when possible, but would defend their territories if threatened. Young Ojibwe hunters were taught to recognize signs of Mahinganini presence: twisted trees marking boundaries, unusual track patterns, and most importantly, areas where game suddenly became scarce or fearful. When early French trappers and missionaries came to Michigan in the 1600s, they encountered these stories and tried to fit them into their own cultural framework. They called the creatures loup-garou, using the French term for werewolf, but their written accounts, preserved in mission records and trading post ledgers, describe something that didn't match traditional European werewolf legends at all. The French records described large wolves that walked upright through forest clearings, watching work parties from a distance. They mentioned attacks on isolated trappers whose bodies were found with injuries that didn't match known predators. They recorded tracks that began as wolf prints and transformed into something closer to human footprints with claws. The missionaries interpreted these accounts through the lens of their own folklore, but they were documenting something real. By the 1800s, when large-scale logging operations began clearing Michigan forests, reports of wolfman encounters increased dramatically. Logging camps recorded multiple incidents of large canines walking upright near work sites, observing crews from tree lines, and occasionally approaching camps at night. The lumber companies dismissed these reports as exhaustion, isolation, or attempts by workers to avoid going back into dangerous forest sections. But some accounts were too specific and too consistent to dismiss easily. In 1873, a logging camp in what is now Manistee National Forest documented an incident where multiple workers saw a large upright creature circling their bunkhouse for 3 consecutive nights. The camp foreman, a practical man with 20 years of forest experience, shot at the creature on the 3rd night. He later described hitting it squarely in the chest with a rifle ball, hearing it yelp and watching it run off on 2 legs before dropping to all 4s. The foreman led a group out at first light to track the wounded creature. They followed a blood trail for over 2 miles through dense forest. The tracks alternated between 4-footed impressions and 2-legged marks, suggesting the creature switched between quadrupedal and bipedal movement depending on terrain and speed requirements. The trail eventually disappeared at a rocky outcropping where tracking became impossible. What convinced the foreman and his men that they'd encountered something unusual was what they found along that blood trail. At several points where the creature had stopped, presumably to rest or assess its injuries, they found claw marks on trees that started 7 feet up and dragged down. The pattern suggested something had gripped the trees with clawed hands while standing upright, using them for support. No known animal in Michigan left marks like that. The logging company filed a report with local authorities, more to document the incident than in hope of official action. The sheriff who reviewed the report noted it as probable wolf attack, though he privately expressed doubt that any wolf could behave the way the men described. The camp continued operations but moved to a different section of forest, and none of the workers who witnessed the encounter returned to that area. Throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s, similar reports continued to surface from logging camps, hunting parties, and isolated homesteads throughout northern Michigan. The patterns remained consistent: large canines walking upright, intelligence beyond normal animal behavior, tracks that shifted between 4-footed and 2-footed impressions, aggressive territorial behavior that stopped short of direct attacks on humans in most cases. By the mid-20th century, as logging declined and Michigan forests began to recover, the reports decreased in frequency but didn't stop entirely. They shifted from work camp incidents to hunter and hiker encounters, people who ventured into rebuilt forest sections where human presence was less constant. The creatures adapted, became more secretive, but didn't disappear. They just learned to avoid areas where humans congregated. But now I had evidence that these creatures weren't legends or mistakes or mass hysteria. They were real enough that the government had procedures for capturing them. Real enough that trained teams operated in the middle of the night with specialized equipment designed specifically for this purpose. Real enough that whatever agency those men worked for had been doing this long enough to make it look routine. I made copies of that 5-second clip and stored them in 3 separate locations. One on a thumb drive buried in a waterproof container on my property. One uploaded to a secure cloud server. One given to a friend who didn't know what was on it, just instructions to release it publicly if anything happened to me. I wasn't being paranoid, I was being practical. That brief footage was the only proof I had that these creatures exist and that the government knows about them. 2 weeks after I found the clip, my cabin was broken into. Nothing valuable was taken. My television, tools, and hunting equipment were all untouched. But my computer was gone, along with every external hard drive I owned. They even took my trail cameras, all 6 of them, including the one that had captured the caged dogman. Whoever broke in knew exactly what they were looking for and where to find it. I filed a police report but didn't mention the footage. I described it as a simple burglary, electronics stolen, probably kids or opportunists looking for things to pawn. The deputy who took the report seemed satisfied with that explanation. He never asked why thieves would take old trail cameras worth maybe $50 each and aging computer equipment, but leave behind a brand new rifle worth $2,000 hanging on my wall. The message was clear. They knew I had the clip. They knew I'd seen what I wasn't supposed to see. But they also knew I'd made copies, because if they didn't think I had, they would have just taken me along with my equipment. Instead, they were sending a warning. Let this go, or the next visit won't be so subtle. The fact that they only took the original equipment and the camera that captured the footage told me they were trying to eliminate the source, while knowing copies existed elsewhere. I started noticing vehicles I didn't recognize parked on roads near my property. Different vehicles, different days, but always someone sitting inside, watching. When I drove to town, the same sedan would appear in my rearview mirror for a few miles before turning off. My phone developed strange clicks and delays during calls. My internet search history started showing signs of being monitored. I wasn't important enough to kill, but I was important enough to watch. That told me something crucial. Whatever they were hiding was big enough that they had resources to surveil random hunters who stumbled onto evidence, but they were also constrained by protocols. They couldn't just make people disappear without attracting attention. They needed plausible deniability, which meant they needed people like me to stay quiet voluntarily. I reached out quietly to other hunters and trappers I'd known for years, asking carefully phrased questions about unusual sightings or encounters. Most had nothing to share beyond the typical bear and wolf stories, but a few, the ones who'd spent the most time in the deepest parts of the forest, had experiences they'd never talked about publicly. One man told me about finding a deer kill that didn't match any predator behavior he'd seen in 40 years of trapping. The deer had been taken down by something that bit through its spine at the base of the skull, a killing method wolves don't use. But what disturbed him most was how the carcass had been arranged afterward. It was laid out deliberately, positioned in the center of a small clearing with its legs folded underneath it. Another hunter described finding what he called a territory marker, a young pine tree stripped of bark in a perfect spiral pattern that went up about 8 feet. The wood underneath was scored with deep scratches that looked like they'd been made by claws, but claws that could grip and pull with precision rather than just raking across the surface. He said it reminded him of how humans would mark trail signs, deliberate and communicative. These weren't random animals behaving oddly. These were signs of intelligence, of something that understood territory and communication and display, something that was apex predator and thinking being at the same time, something that had learned to avoid humans when possible, but would assert itself when necessary. I started mapping the sightings and incidents I could verify. The pattern that emerged was telling. Most encounters happened in 3 specific regions of northern Michigan, areas that were heavily forested, sparsely populated, and had limited road access. These weren't random forests. They were the largest remaining tracts of old-growth timber in the state, places where logging had been restricted for decades and human presence was minimal. These were exactly the kind of places where a population of large, intelligent predators could exist relatively undisturbed. The territory was vast enough to support them, remote enough to avoid regular contact with humans, and protected enough that development wouldn't push them out. If I were trying to hide the existence of an unknown species, these are exactly the areas I would focus my efforts on controlling. I also noticed something else. Each of these regions had experienced increased federal presence over the past decade. Not obvious military bases or research stations, but subtle increases in Forest Service personnel, more frequent land surveys, and restricted access areas that hadn't been restricted before. The official explanations involved wildlife management and environmental protection, but the timing was too convenient. One area in particular caught my attention. About 60 miles north of where my trail camera had been positioned, there was a section of state forest that had been completely closed to public access 3 years ago. The stated reason was soil contamination from old mining operations, but there had been no mining in that area for over a century. The closure came suddenly, with no public comment period and minimal notification. I drove up there one weekend to see what I could learn. The access roads had been barricaded with serious barriers, the kind you'd use to stop vehicles, not just discourage casual trespassers. New fencing ran along the perimeter, 12 feet high, with warning signs about federal prosecution for unauthorized entry. Through binoculars from an adjacent ridge, I could see regular patrols, unmarked vehicles driving perimeter roads that hadn't existed on any map I'd studied. That's when I realized the footage I'd captured wasn't showing me a one-time operation. It was showing me standard procedure. They were managing these creatures the way you'd manage any other wildlife population, capturing individuals, relocating them, maintaining separation between their territory and human activity. The difference was they were doing it in complete secrecy, with resources that suggested this went far beyond state wildlife management. I thought about the implications. If the government knew about dogman populations in Michigan, what else did they know about? Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest followed similar patterns: remote forests, consistent descriptions, occasional physical evidence that never went anywhere officially. The Sasquatch could be real too, managed the same way, kept secret for the same reasons. The reasons for secrecy made sense from a certain perspective. Imagine the chaos if the public learned that 7-foot-tall wolf creatures lived in American forests. Hunting would be disrupted. Tourism would collapse in affected regions. Demands would arise for systematic removal of the creatures, leading to confrontations between those who wanted them protected and those who wanted them gone. There would be legal complications too. These creatures clearly possessed intelligence beyond normal animals. What rights would they have? Could they be hunted? Would they be protected under endangered species laws? Would someone eventually argue they deserved consideration as a form of life that fell somewhere between human and animal? The government had decided the simpler path was to pretend they didn't exist. But pretending something doesn't exist doesn't make it go away. People still encountered these creatures. people still disappeared in ways that didn't make sense. And now people like me had evidence that was becoming harder to suppress as technology improved and more trail cameras captured footage in more remote locations. I made a decision. I would release the 5-second clip, but I would do it carefully. I wouldn't attach my name to it directly. I would let it spread through hunting forums and cryptid enthusiast sites, let it build momentum organically. The surveillance on my property continued, but I knew they were waiting to see what I'd do. As long as I didn't become a public crusader, as long as I didn't try to build a movement around this brief footage, they'd leave me alone. The clip started circulating 3 months after I captured it. Reactions were mixed, as I'd expected. Some people believed it immediately, seeing it as confirmation of what they'd always suspected. Others dismissed it as an elaborate hoax, claiming it was CGI or a trained animal in the cage. The brevity of the footage made it easy to question. 5 seconds wasn't enough to analyze frame by frame, wasn't enough to definitively prove anything to skeptics. But it was enough for people who'd had their own encounters. The forums filled with comments from hunters and outdoorsmen who'd seen similar creatures or found similar evidence. The footage became a catalyst for others to share experiences they'd kept quiet for years. And the government agencies that might have commented declined to do so, which in itself told me something. If it were truly fake, they could have easily debunked it. Their silence suggested they preferred people arguing over its authenticity rather than confirming its truth. I continued hunting, but I changed how I approached it. I'm more careful about where I set up cameras now. I pay attention to areas that seem too quiet, where the normal sounds of forest life fall away and leave something that feels wrong. I avoid the closed sections of state forest entirely. I'm not interested in proving anything anymore. I already know the truth. What I captured on that trail camera wasn't the whole story. It was just one brief moment, 5 seconds, in a much larger picture that the government has been carefully composing for decades. They know cryptids exist. They know where they live. They have protocols for managing them, resources for containing them, and systems for keeping the truth from the public. My footage just happened to catch one moment when those systems were in operation, one instance when their cleanup wasn't quite thorough enough. The dogman in that cage is probably in a facility somewhere now, being studied or contained, or maybe relocated to an area where human contact is less likely. I don't know, and I've accepted I never will. What I do know is that the creature I saw in those 5 seconds wasn't alone. There are others out there, moving through forests that most people will never visit, avoiding contact with humans most of the time, but occasionally crossing paths in ways that leave evidence. That evidence gets collected, filed away, or destroyed by people whose job is to make sure the public never has to confront the reality that we're not the only intelligent beings walking this continent. We share these forests with something older, something that was here long before we cleared the land and built our roads. The Native Americans knew it. Early settlers encountered it, and now the government manages it in secret. I still hear them sometimes when I'm out in the woods at night. That howl that's not quite wolf and not quite anything else. I hear branches breaking in patterns that suggest something large moving on 2 legs. I see tracks that don't belong to any animal I can name. And I know now that I'm not imagining it, not misinterpreting natural phenomena, not letting fear and darkness play tricks on my perception. I'm sharing territory with creatures that have been here far longer than I have. Creatures that have learned to hide, to avoid, to survive in the gaps and spaces we haven't yet claimed completely. Creatures that the government knows about but has decided we're better off not knowing exist. Whether that decision is right or wrong isn't for me to judge. What I can say is this: the next time you're in deep woods and you feel like you're being watched, trust that instinct. The next time you hear something that doesn't sound quite right, pay attention. These creatures are real. They're out there. And while the government might have resources to manage them in remote areas, they can't be everywhere at once. The forests are bigger than any containment operation. The wilderness holds more secrets than any agency can suppress. And sometimes, if you're in the right place at the right time with the right equipment, you'll catch a glimpse of something that shouldn't exist but does. Something that walks the line between animal and human, between legend and reality. My trail camera captured proof that the government knows the truth. I'm sharing that proof now, not because I expect it to change anything, but because people deserve to know what's out there. Cryptids are real. The Dogman exists, and the next time you venture into the Michigan wilderness, remember that you're not alone out there. The 5 seconds of footage I captured shows a caged creature that shouldn't exist according to mainstream science. It shows proof that the government has the equipment and procedures to capture and contain these beings. It shows the truth that Native Americans have been trying to tell us for centuries. These creatures walk among us, hidden but present, and those in power have decided we're better off not knowing the full extent of what shares our forests. I've shared what I found. I've done what I can to document and preserve that brief evidence. Now it's up to others to decide what they believe and what they choose to do with that belief. As for me, I'll keep hunting these woods. I'll keep watching. And I'll keep my cameras running because you never know what you might capture when you're paying attention to the right places. Sometimes 5 seconds is all you need to prove the impossible is real. For more interesting stories like this, consider subscribing.